John Kiriakou was a CIA analyst, and case officer, was a senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a counterterrorism consultant for ABC News, and an author. He was the first U.S. government official to confirm in December 2007 that waterboarding was used to interrogate al-Qaeda prisoners, and he described this as torture. On October 22, 2012, Kiriakou was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison, not for torture, but for talking about torture, over his decision to blow the whistle on the CIA's post-9/11 torture tactics. John Kiriakou.
Thank you. Good morning. I spent 15 years at the CIA, and I would like to speak with you this morning about something that I witnessed in the run-up to the Iraq War, and that was a thirst for war that I had never witnessed before in my career, or indeed in my life. I spent the first half of my career as an analyst at the CIA, working entirely on Iraq. In 1991, in the immediate aftermath of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, I met Ahmed Chalabi. Ahmed Chalabi was an Iraqi Kurd, a Shiite Kurd, which was unusual. He and his family had left Iraq in 1965 for Jordan. Chalabi made something of himself. He went to the University of Chicago. He had a PhD from MIT, a degree from the London School of Economics, and he founded a bank in Jordan called Petrobank, which he immediately began to loot. He stole something like $36 million, mostly from Iraqi refugees and retirees, people who had fled Iraq over the years or who had retired in Iraq. I'm sorry, who had retired in Jordan. He essentially stole their life savings. But the CIA identified Ahmed Chalabi as somebody who ought to be the president of Iraq. Why? Because he served the CIA's purposes, at least in 1991. Chalabi went on later that year to found the Iraqi National Congress, a group of yes men active in Iraqi opposition circles, almost entirely in the West. Most of the members of the Iraqi National Congress hadn't been to Iraq in decades, but as I said, they had been identified as people that Washington would like to see running the country. Once Chalabi was made president of the Iraqi National Congress, the CIA began to notice some things. Number one, nothing Chalabi ever said was true. He lied about absolutely everything. In addition, the millions of dollars of taxpayer money that was going to finance the Iraqi National Congress began to disappear. At the same time, Chalabi bought a multi-million-dollar townhouse in Knightsbridge, London. Finally, the CIA issued something called a burn notice on Chalabi, meaning that no CIA officer was allowed to have contact with him because he could not be trusted. He was a liar and a thief. 11 years later, in 2002, I was told, having just returned from Pakistan, that I would be working on a compartmented program. I was not even allowed to know what my job was going to be until I signed a separate secrecy agreement. I went up to the CIA's 6th floor and actually signed a series of secrecy agreements, 6 of them. Once I had finished, I said to the man reading me into the compartment, "So what gives?" And he looked at me and said, "Well, here's the story. Early next year, we're going to invade Iraq, we're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and we're going to open the world's largest Air Force base in southern Iraq. We're going to move all of our air assets out of Saudi Arabia into Iraq, thus denying Osama bin Laden the ability to say that we're polluting the land of the 2 holy mosques." I was so stunned by this ridiculous revelation that all I could think to say was, "But we haven't caught bin Laden yet." And this officer told me that the battle lines had already been drawn. He said the decision was made, and there were 2 camps. The war was being pushed specifically by the Office of the Vice President, that was Dick Cheney at the time, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and the National Security Council. He said CIA, the Joint Chiefs, and the State Department didn't want to do it, but being good soldiers, we saluted and said, "Yes, Mr. President." A day later, I walked into this same man's office, and he was sitting at his desk with a blank piece of white paper and some Crayola crayon markers, just to make conversation. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm designing the new Iraqi flag." I said, "Don't you think the Iraqis should design the new Iraqi flag?" It actually hadn't occurred to him that the Iraqi people should design their flag. In the following weeks, it became clear to me that Ahmed Chalabi was going to have a role in whatever came out of the muck and mire that we had turned Iraq into. The CIA rejected him, as I said. There was a burn notice against him. But Chalabi began appearing in Washington regularly at parties in Georgetown, at the Pentagon, at the office of the Vice President. Because the CIA had rejected him, Chalabi decided to activate his quote-unquote army of intelligence operatives and to report directly to the Vice President's office. But we all knew that Chalabi was a liar. The only thing Chalabi cared about was Chalabi, and he cared about becoming president of Iraq. And so he told Cheney's staff and Rumsfeld's staff and Rumsfeld's chain of command beneath him that was created just to invade Iraq and to handle intelligence exactly what they wanted to hear. None of it was based in the truth. And there was a quid pro quo. The quid pro quo was, I'll give you the intelligence you need to convince the American people and the US Congress that you need to go to war. And when this is all done, you make me president of Iraq. Cheney and Rumsfeld agreed. Chalabi knew that the administration was obsessed with two issues: weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. He also knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So he just simply manufactured the intelligence. I remember specifically one night that I had been called into the CIA's operations center. Joe Wilson, who had been chargé d'affaires at the US Embassy in Baghdad in the early 1990s, had been sent to Niger to speak with the government of Niger to ask if it was true, if rumors were true, that the Iraqis had sought the purchase of yellow cake uranium. Joe Wilson had been ambassador to Niger after he left Iraq. And the government of Niger said that none of it was true, that the Iraqis had not sent an emissary, and certainly they had not, the Nigerian government had not received any request for the purchase of yellow cake uranium. Joe Wilson wrote this up in the New York Times as an op-ed, and of course his wife, Valerie Plame's career was later destroyed by it. But I was called into CIA headquarters to review a document that the CIA had received from a friendly intelligence service that seemed to corroborate Chalabi's story. I went in to look at this document. Within 5 seconds, anyone who had ever served in any intelligence capacity in the US government could see that this document was a forgery. It wasn't even formatted correctly. I mean, there were spelling errors and grammatical errors, and it was obviously patched together by someone who had no idea how this kind of thing worked. I said it was a forgery. The CIA's Iraq analysts agreed. It was a forgery. It was clear that the Iraqis had not sought yellow cake uranium from the government of Niger. But Chalabi didn't care what the CIA said. Chalabi cared only that the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense were happy. Chalabi also passed information to Cheney and Rumsfeld indicating that there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, between the government of Iraq and al-Qaeda. Nothing could have been any more ridiculous than that. There was a famous story from the 1980s when Saddam Hussein had made the minor pilgrimage, the Umrah, to Mecca. he didn't even know the prayers to say. And his vice president at the time, Izzat Ibrahim, had to kneel behind him and whisper the prayers to him so that he could repeat them out loud. Saddam Hussein wasn't a Muslim. He was a secularist. There was no reason for Saddam Hussein to have any connection with al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. And indeed, bin Laden had made comments over the years that he hated Saddam Hussein as much as he hated the United States. So this connection, Mohammed Atta allegedly going to Prague to meet with the station chief of the Iraqi intelligence service there, was just made up out of whole cloth, because he knew, Chalabi knew, that it was a red button issue that would help to push us into war. That's exactly what happened. George W. Bush tried to install Ahmed Chalabi as the president of Iraq once we had invaded. But we had already, in such a short period of time, made such a colossal mess out of the place that even the Iraqis wouldn't accept him as president. Unfortunately, he did get something. He became the oil minister. That's not the crime in this whole thing, Ahmed Chalabi promoting himself. The crime is that Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld knew all along that the intelligence was phony. They were just looking for a pretext for war. And they knew that many Americans are too stupid or too disinterested to challenge any of this. They were looking for a trigger that would allow them to install their warped neoconservative vision of democracy in Iraq. I remember participating in a secure video teleconference with the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense. It was chaired by Vice President Cheney. I was a minor figure, and so I was a note taker for the director of the CIA sitting against the back wall. And I remember a very senior official of this government saying, in complete seriousness, as soon as we cross the border, they're going to throw flowers at us, having no understanding that we were invading a sovereign country, slaughtering its people. And he believed that we would be greeted as friends and liberators. No, the crime is that millions of Iraqis were killed, they were wounded, they were maimed, they were displaced. Thousands of Americans died for nothing, no good reason at all. That's the crime, and that's why we're here today. It's up to all of us to demand justice, even though time has passed. No matter how much time has passed, we have to demand justice. Thank you very much.